It's interesting to look back at the entire span of the 20th century and think about the waves of immigration and the waves of policy response to immigration. So if we go back to the early part of the 20th century and even sneak back into the late 19th century, that was the big wave of European migration. Often some of us who write in the area talk about that as the Ellis Island era, where many, many people came not only through Ellis Island, but also other ports of entry and found their way into this industrializing, growing United States economy. So a substantial amount of migration peaking in the first and second decades of the 20th century. In the 1920s, we saw the introduction of more restrictive policies with regard to immigration, which slowed down, in combination with World War I, the flow of migrants into the US. And then that was followed by the Great Depression in the 1930s, so the immigration didn't quite pick up there, but began to pick up a little bit in the period following that. And then again, World War II had an influence. But following that, immigration began to pick up a little bit, and then particularly was changed in the 1965 Immigration and Nationality Act revisions, where the national origins quotas that had been introduced in the 1920s were put aside for different criteria of admission that emphasized family reunification. And that gave rise to a different mix of immigrants coming in. And some of the individuals that we think of now as in the first and second generation children of immigrants, we see as the result of the 1960s and 70s. And then as we work through the rest of the century, we see a broad upswing in immigration in the 70s and into the 1980s. But again, into the 1980s, we see some building concerns about the level of immigration. And we see that perhaps encapsulated in the 1986 Immigration Reform and Control Act, or IRCA. And that act was passed in response to, you could say, broadly concerns about the number of immigrants, but more specifically about the concerns of the number of undocumented immigrants that were in the United States at the time and were seemingly to come in regularly over the borders. And so IRCA, as it's called for short, after several years of debate, finally passed in 1986, and that brought in with it a series of new policies and regulations that had influences on who could get in, issues of border control, and provided opportunities for legalization for those who were already in the United States and had been contributors, if you wish, and been living here successfully for several years. And so following IRCA, there was a period of legalizations that brought in a number of new legal permanent residents to the United States who were not just recently arrived, but recently legalized. And so we see a spike in apparent immigrants in the period of time a few years after IRCA. And then after the IRCA period, we see some immigration policies enacted, maybe smaller in scale, but nonetheless important, around 1990 and the early 1990s, which made various other kinds of adjustments about immigration admission categories, leading us to where we were by the end of the 20th century and now into the 21st century in our discussions of immigration nowadays.